My name is Whitley, and I am 32 years old. I stood inside the small dressing room of St. Agnes Chapel, gazing at my reflection in a mirror that had witnessed countless brides before me. Instead of joy, I felt only a deep, empty dread filling my chest. My wedding gown fit flawlessly, my hair was styled precisely as I had rehearsed, and the bouquet of white roses shook gently in my hands. Through the thin wall, I could clearly hear my father's voice as he spoke to my uncle, loud enough that many guests must have overheard too. He works in a warehouse, my father was telling my uncle without lowering his voice. A warehouse. My daughter is marrying a nobody who operates a forklift for a living. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe through the pain the way I had been doing for the past 8 months, ever since I first introduced Julian to my family. They had never given him a real chance. At Thanksgiving, my mother had asked him in front of everyone whether he had any serious plans for his future. As though single-handedly raising his 2 younger siblings after losing both parents in a car crash at age 19 was not already a tremendous achievement and proof of his character. My father had refused to shake Julian's hand the first time they met and had stayed cold ever since. To them, Julian's rough hands, simple apartment, and ordinary steady job made him invisible, someone unworthy of respect, but I loved him deeply. I loved how he remembered exactly how I liked my coffee, how he once drove 4 hours through a blizzard just to bring me soup when I was ill, and how he never asked me to pick between him and my family, even when they made it obvious they wished he would disappear. So when my father knocked on the dressing room door and entered without waiting, I already knew what he would say. "Your grandfather isn't coming," he stated flatly. He had a golf commitment. And honestly, Whitley, I'm not walking you down the aisle either. I refuse to stand in front of 200 people and act like I'm proud of this. I stared at him, hoping he would laugh and say it was a cruel joke, but his expression remained hard and serious. "Dad, please," I whispered. "This is my wedding day. Walk by yourself." "That's what happens when you marry a nobody." He spoke so casually, as if discussing the weather, then turned and left the room. A short while later, through the slightly open door, I saw him sit down in the very last pew next to my mother. He crossed his arms, lifted his chin, and positioned himself like a spectator ready to enjoy a performance. My father had chosen to sit in the back row with Mom to watch me walk alone, treating my humiliation as the entertainment he had anticipated all week. The wedding coordinator came to my side, looking unsure, and asked if I wanted to delay the ceremony or have someone else escort me. I looked past her toward the closed chapel doors, toward the muffled sounds of 200 waiting guests, and toward Julian waiting at the altar on the other side, probably wondering about the delay. Something inside me grew firm. I would not allow my father's cruelty to ruin this day for me. I would not give him the pleasure of seeing me break down. "No," I said, straightening my back. "I'll walk myself." The doors opened, the music began, and every head turned in my direction. I held my bouquet tightly and started walking down the aisle alone. My heels clicked against the old wooden floor as I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead on Julian. He stood motionless at the altar, his jaw clenched, clearly having just realized what my father had done. I could sense the whispers spreading through the crowd, eyes scanning the empty space beside me where my father should have been. I was halfway down the aisle, my breath unsteady and my knees almost buckling under the emotional weight, when I heard the heavy chapel doors behind me open once more. I paused, thinking perhaps my father had changed his mind and some trace of regret had finally touched him. But when I turned around, what I saw made my heart skip completely. 30 people in matching charcoal gray suits entered quietly and lined both sides of the aisle with calm, purposeful movements that brought the entire chapel to silence. They wore identical formal attire, their expressions serious and united, and they stood shoulder to shoulder like a protective wall along the pews. Gasps echoed through the guests. My mother started to rise from her seat. My father's arrogant look shifted into confusion. One man, tall with silver hair and the confident presence of a leader, stopped right beside the back row. He turned, looked directly at my dad, and said, "Sir." The whole chapel fell into complete, heavy silence as everyone waited to hear what would follow and to learn who these 30 people were. "Sir," the silver-haired man repeated, his voice steady yet commanding enough to reach every corner. "With all due respect, you don't get to sit there and watch this." Not after what you just did to your daughter." My father's mouth opened and closed without producing any words, while my mother pressed her hand to her chest. I remained frozen in the middle of the aisle, bouquet trembling, completely unable to grasp what was happening or who these people were. The silver-haired man turned toward me and gave a small, respectful nod. "Miss Whitley, please forgive our striking entrance. My name is Desmond Acaffer. I am the Regional Director of Operations for Holcrest Logistics." The name didn't register at first, until I noticed Julian's face at the altar turn pale with surprise, his eyes shining with sudden understanding. Holcrest Logistics was the company Julian worked for. Desmond Acaffer was Julian's boss's boss, a man Julian had spoken of only a few times, always with quiet admiration. 6 years ago, Desmond went on, his voice clear enough to fill the silent chapel. Julian Reyes entered our warehouse as a 19-year-old young man who had just lost both his parents and was raising his 2 younger siblings by himself. He accepted every shift available. He never complained. He trained new employees without being asked, identified safety issues that prevented major lawsuits, and quietly guided many young men who had few other options. 2 years ago, when our Denver facility faced closure and the loss of 400 jobs, Julian redesigned our entire intake system and saved that location. He is, without any exaggeration, one of the most remarkable employees I have encountered in 30 years in this industry. Tears ran down my cheeks, not from sorrow anymore, but from a deep sense of pride swelling inside me. Desmond gestured toward the 30 people standing along the aisle. Every person here either works under Julian or has worked with him, and volunteered to come the moment they learned how his own family viewed him. We did not come to create a spectacle. We came because a man who has silently supported so many others deserved to have people support him today, especially when those who should have done so failed to appear. He looked straight at my father again. "A forklift operator, you called him." I would call him the backbone of a company that employs 4,000 people. And honestly, I would trust him with more responsibility than many men in expensive suits. The chapel filled with hushed murmurs and growing applause. I watched my father's face lose all its pride, replaced by a small, embarrassed expression he clearly had not expected to feel in front of so many witnesses. My mother stared down at her hands, unable to look at anyone. I turned back toward the aisle and continued walking toward Julian, who was now crying openly, his shoulders trembling as he saw the people he had quietly helped over the years stand up for him in his moment of need. Desmond stepped aside respectfully and motioned toward me. "Please continue. We simply wanted him to know he was not entering this family by himself." I held my bouquet firmly and walked the remaining distance between 2 lines of strangers who, in that instant, felt far more like family than the people I had grown up with. When I reached Julian, he took my hands and whispered that he loved me, his voice cracking. I whispered back that I had never been prouder to become his wife. The ceremony continued, but the atmosphere had changed, filled with an electric energy that everyone present would remember forever. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to the marriage, the silence was so profound you could hear the candles flicker. I glanced at my father, who kept his eyes lowered and remained quiet. We exchanged our vows, and when Julian placed the ring on my finger, the entire chapel stood and applauded, with the 30 people in gray clapping the loudest. At the reception, my father came up to me once awkwardly and muttered something close to an apology about not understanding and being mistaken. I told him I appreciated the words, but that actions would matter more, and he had significant work to do before I could fully trust them. Julian, always kind, still shook his hand and thanked him for attending, because that was simply who Julian was, a man who built bridges even for those who had not earned them. Later that evening, as we danced under the string lights with Julian's arms around me, I realized my father had spent years trying to prove that Julian was worthless, when in reality, Julian possessed more value than my father would ever comprehend. True worth was never measured by job titles or income. It came from being present, from lifting others up instead of tearing them down, and from being the kind of person that 30 strangers would leave everything to support. My family had ridiculed my husband as a nobody and left me to walk alone, but in the end, it was Julian's nobody, who filled the aisle with worthy somebodies. And it was Julian's love that showed me what genuine value truly means.